I know, how do I start that? Very good. And then we're gonna hide that, and then we're gonna make this bigger. All right, and we're gonna go back. Okay, we're back again. Well, again, we're really happy to have Robert Bertin here to elucidate some of our knowledge about the floristic changes in southern New England orchid and other species. And before anything blows up, Robin, it's up to you.
There is one
That
little.
should not
Yep,
be able to
Beverly,
develop.
yeah.
Right.
How do I get back?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
And then push it all the way to the top.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if I can get it to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
That works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Never find.
All right.
Never find that.
Robert, you can move on.
Thanks very much, Dave, and thanks for the invitation. As Dave mentioned, I'm particularly interested in floristic, or the, it's have to stand here, folks can see in the poem, right? In the flora of southern New England, of this area and so forth, and I've been studying it in some form or another for 20 or 30 years. And I'm particularly time out.
Now, I just wanted to get the microphone.
Well, it doesn't seem to be nice if somebody could contact somebody who's listening in and see if they,
Yeah.
you could call Elise Christie and see if she can hear us.
They don't see that microphone showing up. Then. Camera. Because that one isn't lighting up.
Is it possible if we?
If we can try to, there we go.
It seems to be working, right?
Yeah.
This is the line projector.
Yes, I do.
Let's see if that. Oh, someone's talking to it. Let me just see. Well, they heard me earlier. Can you hear us now? Anybody in the chat?
We can hear you.
Yes, we can hear.
Okay, wow, there was a voice out of nowhere. Wonderful.
Hello, Robert.
Hi, George.
Oh, man. Where's that? Hide that. Hide floating.
video?
Hiding floating panning.
There we go.
All right, here we go again.
All right, well, hello again. I mentioned I do research on floras and how they change over time, and today I'm going to share a couple of stories that have come out of that work. One of them pertaining to orchids, and the other pertaining to northern species. And I would like to point out these individuals on the right were my colleagues in this work, Glenn and Bertin. Are working with me on the Orchid project, and Caitlin Spind is a Holy Cross student, former Holy Cross student, who worked with me on the northern species. So two little stories here. Let's have a look first at the orchids. Oops, let's see here. How do I advance that?
The arrow keys right there.
Oop.
Where are they?
Oh, you have the magic touch. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so first off, the orchids. I guess you're probably familiar with the term charismatic megafauna, okay, to refer to bald eagles and bison and lions and elephants, things like that. I think if there was an equivalent term in botany, it would probably apply to the orchids. The orchids are one of the two largest plant families. They're still counting, but there's around 28,000 known species of orchids. Many of them, as represented here, have spectacular flowers, very exotic, distinctive looking things. I might add that lots also have very small and inconspicuous flowers, so there's a lot of variety there. A lot of interesting pollination mechanisms among the orchids. One of the most unusual is the pollination by pseudocopulation, where the flowers actually mimic insects. The one on the right, which is called the bee orchid, that mimics a female bumblebee closely enough that the males come and try to mate with it, and in doing so, they exchange, move the pollen around. And there are other ones. There's quite a number of species of orchids that do this. Some of them use wasps rather than bees. All orchids, as far as we know, have an obligate dependence on fungi. Orchid seeds are not much bigger than dust particles. They're wind dispersed. There's essentially no food in the seed, as there is in a pea seed or a bean seed. And orchids rely on a fungal in an
The sound is cutting in and out, mostly out.
8,000. That's to come. Which is pretty good. And all of the
White slipper.
some of these date back but you never all right. These floras, there are 2 counties in southern New England that have been examined in detail. And these are Worcester County and Franklin County in this state. And by examined in detail, I mean we have town by town records of all of the plant species. But despite the fact that southern New England has been botanized probably as intensively as any part of North America, those are the only, that's the only geographical area in southern New England where we have really systematic accounts. So we have good data for all orchid species for those 2 counties. So that's a start. The recent information, by the way, comes from multi-year field work, in one case 10 years, in one case 18 years, that involved multiple individuals, including Matt Hickler sitting right here. And so the recent data is quite good. And then there were also extensive historical collections made in these counties by botanists in an earlier century. So we have good historical information there too. But how about for the rest of southern New England? There are a few potential sources of data. On the left, herbarium specimens, and there are large herbarium collections at many academic institutions in southern New England. Harvard has the biggest academic herbarium collection in the world. And if you look at a timeline of plant collecting, it's not uniform over time. It's nowhere close to that. The golden era of plant collecting was probably from late 1800s into partway into the 1900s. And in Worcester County, it actually continued up till about 1950 because of a group that was working at Clark University there. So we have good early records based on these herbarium collections. But what of more recent records? What can we do there? Well, people still collect, but as I'll show in a moment, they don't collect nearly as much as they used to. So we can't simply look at an herbarium collection and say, okay, they're not collecting as many yellow lady slippers, so it must be less common. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. But we have some other potential sources. iNaturalist records. I don't know, does anyone use iNaturalist here? Oh, okay, good. That, as you know, is a digital platform for basically posting photographs and georeference photographs, I would say, of all manner of living things. And there are, I don't know, millions of records in iNaturalist at this point, including some of plants, some from Massachusetts and so forth. So that's one a data source that we wanted to look at and see how useful that is. And then we also have records from the state natural heritage programs. All 3 southern New England states have a natural heritage program. They keep track of all of the state listed species, okay? And they try to revisit the known populations at least every 25 years. And so we have good current information on state listed species. So it's really the other species that is the non-state listed species that we have to see whether we have useful data here. Okay, so the very first thing that we did is we used these very detailed floras for these 2 counties to assess how good the recent herbarium collecting was and the recent iNaturalist records were, to see if they could be useful more broadly. So what you see here is a list of 10 orchid species, and these are not state listed species because lots of times in iNaturalist, as you know, rare species locations are obscured and so forth. So I wanted to have things that were not state listed, and in the column here is the number of towns in which they were found by these two published floras, and you can see they range depending on the species from 6 up to 85. There are a total of 86 towns in these 2 counties. So we located pink lady slipper in 85 of those 86, but others are less common. Then if you look over in these 2 columns, this shows the percent of those towns that are represented by recent herbarium specimens. And you can see that recent herbarium collections are a lousy representation of what's actually out there. The average, they capture 12% of the towns where we know these species occur. Okay, and in fact, these data are a bit biased because we did a lot of collecting in Franklin and Worcester counties, so probably in other counties, the number is actually less than that. Okay, so recent herbarium collections are not very helpful. And iNaturalist record are not especially good either. They capture fewer than 50% of the towns. But more importantly, for our work, the percent of towns they capture is really variable. So for a species like pink lady slipper that is easily recognized, has large with conspicuous flowers that grows in places where people are inclined to walk, good records. They've captured nearly 90%, which is excellent. But the one right above it, pale coral root, is a small, inconspicuous orchid that tends to grow in damp areas, and only less than 15% of the towns are captured there. So in fact, if we used either of these data sources as an indication of recent abundance of these species, it would be, number one, incomplete, and number two, give us biased data. Okay, so unfortunately, we can't use those data to make general statements about what's going on in southern New England. And for those of you who do use iNaturalist, I'm not at all disparaging it. As you add to it, it becomes more useful, and it's useful for lots of things, although not for the particular purposes that we have in mind here. Okay, so what do we end up with? For state listed species only, we can look at all of the southern New England states because we have the natural heritage data as well as good herbarium collections. And that's how I define the recent and the historical, basically because they look back 25 years, and that is approximately that time. And then we also have the data from Franklin and Worcester counties from these floras for the species that occur there, and that's for all species. Okay, so those are really the data sets we're working with. And before we get to the results, one thing that we ought to think about here is, do those two sources of information give us the same result? Are they correlated with one another? And so we looked at the relationship between species that overlap in these two data sources to see if there was any correlation between the patterns of, oops, sorry, I've jumped ahead of myself. If we're going to talk about change, we need to be able to express it numerically. This is the index we used. All you have to know is it's going to be -1 if a species has disappeared. It'll be +1 if a species was not known historically and is now known. It will be 0 if a species was found in the same number of towns historically and in the recent period. So it varies from -1 to +1. 0 indicates no change. Minus indicates it's declining, apparently. Plus indicates it's increasing. Yes.
That's fine in this one as well. We haven't,
Oops.
that we haven't, the unstate, the ones that haven't been collected recently? Or
Yeah, let me, no, really all I'm trying to do here is figure out what sources of data will be useful in getting at the question of how orchids have changed. So I'm trying to identify which data and which sets of species we can actually talk about in a valid fashion.
And does that include what actually may have hybridized or moved into here that you mentioned a little bit before you started this? Or is that just what you know is native to here?
Well, first of all, almost everything I'm going to say pertains to native orchid species. There's only one non-native one that you're likely to see around, and I'll mention that, but basically we're dealing with native species. And for the most part, we're not dealing with things that have appeared or disappeared. For the most part, we're dealing with changes in abundance. How common did they used to be, as represented by how many towns they used to be found in, compared to how many towns they're found in today?
I see.
That's what we're getting at.
And you're definitely referencing back in the 1800s that you're saying for proof that in fact they're native.
Well, we know, we have good information that, again, except for this one species called Bertin, all of these are native. So really, most everything I'm going to say pertains just to native species.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And do interrupt if there are other questions, because there is a bit of quantitative stuff in here, and I want to make sure we got that right. So, good. So those are the two sets of data we're working with. This was just indicating how we're representing change. with this one number that varies from -1 to +1. Okay. And then the next question, the one I said we were going to look at here, is do the county data, Franklin and Worcester, bear any resemblance to what's going on in the rest of southern New England? And so this is a correlation where I've plotted the change index in Franklin and Worcester counties on the vertical axis, and in southern New England, exclusive of those two counties, on the x-axis here. Did I say y-axis, x-axis? The relationship is positive. That R indicates that there's a positive relationship. A best fit line would go up at almost a 45-degree angle there. It's not a perfect correlation. We wouldn't really expect it to be, but there is a strong and significant correlation between what's going on in Franklin and Worcester County and in the rest of southern New England. So that's important, because if they had no relationship to one another, then we wonder what's going on. You know, we wouldn't really know. All right, so that's the background. Now the actual results. What did we find? Are orchids increasing? Are they decreasing? Whatever. So let me explain this. You probably can't read the names. Well, you may be able to read the names of the orchids. This was actually a very tall graph that I chopped in half, and I put the top half on that side and the bottom half over here just so it would all fit on the same screen. This line right here is a change index of 0. Anything to the left of that is a species that's decreasing. Anything to the right of that is a species that's increasing. Notice the trend, a very clear trend here. And in fact, there are a number of species there with values of -1. That means that in the states, this is the state listed species, in the states where they're listed, a number of them have disappeared. Okay, in some cases, they're listed just in Rhode Island, sometimes in all 3 states, whatever. But almost everything is on the left side there. The only ones that aren't on the left side are those 2 species, so we might have a look at those. This one down here, which has a value of 1, this is called the southern tway blade, Neotia bifolia. The reason that has a value of 1 is because it was unknown until about 10 or 15 years ago in southern New England. And somebody ran across it. I believe they've now found it in 2 towns in 1 county in Massachusetts. Now, did it appear and it wasn't here before? We can't know for sure. My suspicion is it was always here. It's not a very conspicuous species. It would probably be easy to overlook. And so my guess is it was probably there and it just had not been found. The other species, the one right above it, actually has, although the value is positive, it's scarcely positive. It's very little different from 0. And this is something called autumn coral root that actually is up and about at this time of year, or kind of late August through October. It's also a fairly inconspicuous species. And the fact that this value doesn't differ very much from 0, I don't know if I'd want to make a case that it's either increasing or decreasing. But the clear pattern here for these state listed species is they are declining. But then you might say, aren't you biasing your results by just choosing state listed species? After all, they're the ones that we expect to be having trouble. Perhaps. So let's switch now and look at the data from Worcester and Franklin County, where we had data for all orchid species, not just the state listed ones. And same sort of graph. Again, you notice the weight is heavily on the left side of the graph, and this includes a mixture of state listed and non-state listed species. Again, it's informative to look at the few that have positive numbers, and I've magnified the bottom 2 for you. The one on the bottom with this increase, that's the introduced one. That's Helberine, Epipactis helberine, and you can find that pretty much everywhere in Franklin and Worcester County. That is in every town, just about. It is native to Europe. And it found its, I don't know, any thoughts, Matt, on how it might have got here? I really don't know. Conceivably, the dust-like seeds could travel in the upper atmosphere, but they probably would have had to go across Asia and around that way, because that's the way the prevailing winds go. But they're here, they're doing well. They have rather broad habitat tolerances. I have them coming up in my vegetable garden of all places, but why that one is successful when all of the native ones are having trouble, I mean, I don't know. I really don't know. Notice the second one is Coralorhiza odontorhiza. That's the autumn coral root that we saw a little increase for in where it's listed, state listed. So that suggests maybe that species is actually increasing a little bit, perhaps. These other ones, I wouldn't want to make a case for those actually increasing. And the reason that I say that is that in Franklin and Worcester County, the recent sampling was probably more systematic, was definitely more systematic than the historical sampling. And so I think these numbers are probably just an artifact of that more intense sampling. Notice, by the way, that most of these are common ones. Goodyear pubescens is the rattlesnake plantain. The one above it is pink lady slipper. The one above that is lady's tresses, the common lady's tresses. Those are all common species. And I think we were just more systematic about recording the towns where we found them than the folks were historically. Well, when we went about it, for example, Worcester County, 60 towns, I kept track of every species in every town where I found it. And I specifically looked for those species I had not found in a town. So if I saw I hadn't gotten a bunch of wetland species, I would specifically go to wetlands and try to find those. And we did the same thing in Franklin County. Yeah, and historically, their efforts were somewhat systematic, but not that systematic. Yeah. So the pattern here then is pretty clear, I would say. This is if you'll excuse me for using the word again, this is a quite systematic look at how orchids are changing, and they do appear to be declining. Pretty clear evidence of that. One of the suggestions people have made is, could this be partly an artifact of sampling? Could it be that orchids, which tend to be relatively rare species, maybe you're just not sampling them very thoroughly? So it occurred to us in Franklin County, we had good data on the historical abundance of all plant species. So we were able to compare the change index in orchids that were found in 1 to 4 towns historically with the change index, the average change index in all other plant species that were found in 1 to 4 towns historically. We actually deleted grasses and trees and things that weren't like orchids. But you can see that in almost every case here, the orchid change index is much more negative than the change index for the other species. So, and this is the first time, as far as I know, that this analysis has been done anywhere in the world. And so it's not just that these are rare species and therefore we're going to undersample them. Compared to other rare species, they're also doing poorly. All right, well, let's actually look at a few species and with maps. I always like to look at maps. They give us a good idea. So here's grass pink, Calopogon tuberosus, a bog species. The key here, this is Worcester County, and I'm sorry that for some reason the image here is compressed side to side, so it looks a bit funny. This is the dividing line between the two counties right there. So this is Worcester, that's Franklin County, 60 towns here, 26 there. A town where there are both historical and recent records is represented in black. Recent only represented in dark gray, historical only in light gray. So you can see that this species we found in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 towns in these two counties. But historically, it was present in a lot more. And that translates to a change index of minus 0.53. This is a bog species. I don't know. Has anyone been out to Holly Bog? know that in town of Holly, that black town on the far left, that's Holly. So that's data point, both historical and recent from Holly Bog. I don't know if anyone has been to Poutwater Pond in, well, Poutwater Pond in Holden. Yep. And Calipogon is in fact still there. Anyway, clearly declining. Another species, long-bracted orchid. We found it in one town each in those two counties. It was present in lots more historically. And this is a species that I think is just in the process of being listed now. It was watch list and they're moving it to, as they should. Showy orchid, Galearis. It's still present quite a bit in Franklin County, all those black towns and the dark gray ones. But there's a bunch of other towns in Franklin County where it was known historically. We didn't find it, and I never saw it in Worcester County. Okay, there are no records, as far as I know, from Worcester County for 40 years or something like that. Platanthera flava, threatened species. Again, it's present in both counties, 3 towns in Franklin County, excuse me, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 towns in Worcester County, but again, present in a lot more towns historically. Slender ladies' tresses. This is one of the less common ladies' tresses. That one has really declined a lot. And my sense of this, I don't know if any of you have seen this, but where I've seen it, it is a species of dry open habitats. And I'm guessing this is a victim of succession. You know, where you have these, we have less of that habitat around. And I actually, this one is not a state listed species. And I actually suggested to Bob Wernerl that he might want to consider listing it. But he pointed out that there are apparently sites on the Cape and the islands where it's still doing quite well. So he didn't really see a need for listing it. But in interior Massachusetts, it does seem to be declining quite dramatically. And then for something a little different, here's our introduced one. Here's Epipactis helberine, or the helberine. That picture was taken in my vegetable garden, by the way. And it's not asparagus, I'll tell you that. Okay, so my guess is it's everywhere, and we just haven't picked it up in some of the towns, but that one has, notice that's positive change index. You're not going to see very many of those. All right, so that's what's going on with orchids in terms of numbers. Yes, I do think they're declining, but there's another half to that question. Yes, go ahead.
Do we have an idea of what year this was introduced?
Yes, and I don't remember the date offhand, but we can at least say when it was first represented in an herbarium collection. And if I'm not mistaken, it was out in Western Mass, in the Berkshire County, maybe 100 years ago, something like that. Yeah. Whereas most of the native species, the collections actually go back earlier. Yeah. So we've documented declines, but in a sense, the more interesting part of the question is what's causing these? And this, as you'll see, has proved to be a very, very difficult nut to crack. This slide just points out, here's a bunch of other studies. Orchid loss is in pink, loss of other species is in gray. So it turns out these results are consistent with a bunch of studies in limited geographical areas. Okay. So what factors might be involved here? First of all, is it possible that it's an issue of sampling error in some way, and this is not a real decline? My colleague Matt here hastens to point out that those historical records were collected over a period of over 100 years. The recent records were collected over 25 years, say. Orchids are known for not always coming up every year. Could it be that they were simply better sampled in the historical period? It's possible this is involved. I'm dubious that it counts for most of the change, partly, for example, because these ones that are avidly tracked by the Natural Heritage Program, we're still seeing declines in those. So I don't think it's a sampling issue, but a number of other things, succession, the replacement of open habitats with trees, maybe. Herbivory by deer. We have much more deer than we did 100 years ago. By slugs. Some of our most important slugs are introduced species. Introduced species, slugs, earthworms. Essentially, I'm not sure, maybe somebody here knows, do we have any native North American earthworms in Massachusetts? I know in Vermont, they don't. There are no, I don't know if it's true in Massachusetts too. Are there any native North American earthworms in Massachusetts? If there are very few species. The vast majority come in from either Europe or Asia. Now, why might that be relevant for orchids? Well, what do worms eat? Organic matter, leaves and stuff. Orchids depend on associations with fungi. What do fungi eat? Organic matter. Maybe there's something going on there. Okay, can't be sure. Acidification, nutrient enrichment, that is, our rainfall has more nitrogen in it today than it did 100 years ago. Okay, those could be factors. And then how about climate change? I mean, we know things are warming. I've heard that storms are becoming more intense. So these are some possibilities. And it's difficult to get at some of these things, like how would you try to evaluate whether earthworms were responsible for orchid decline? That would be incredibly difficult to evaluate. It's possible. Well, but can you mimic the conditions you need to mimic in the lab? I don't know. Could you find places that don't have introduced? I don't know. That would be tough to do. Anyway, we did look at a few things. And these are 4 that I'm going to talk about here. We looked at habitat, that is open versus closed habitats, open versus wooded, if you will. We looked at leaf size. We figure if herbivory is important, maybe it's those big leafed orchids that are going to be the targets for deer. How about pollinators? They're pollinated, some by bees, some by leps, some by flies, some do it themselves. And then trying to get a climate change location within the plant range. Are the northern species the ones that are suffering? Or is there no pattern there? Okay, so I'm going to present some data here, and I'll tell you right off the bat, it's not going to be very satisfactory. All right, first of all, wooded and open habitats. If you look over there at the data on Franklin and Worcester County, it looks intriguing, okay? This is change index. So species of open habitats have a much more negative change index than species of wooded habitats. So that suggests that's the pattern you'd expect to see if succession was an issue. But look at the data for the rare species in southern New England. I guess that means it's actually the reverse. There's very little difference between those numbers. So the pattern is not consistent. And by the way, I stuck these on. These are what are called p-values by statisticians. To be significant, that is the result not being due to chance, those have to be 0.05 or less. So that's what we're interested in. But you're so I'll go back.
That is
This is the ocean is not part It turns out there is no relationship here, although the insects. The insect not quite there. Pollinated ones and the bee pollinated ones are doing the best. But again, it's not, the difference is not significant here. And sample size is pretty small. We only have 3 live pollinated species in this sample. So again, a hint that something might be going on, but nothing definitive for sure. And then finally, changes comparing northern and southern orchids. So I've arrayed the orchids. Each dot is an orchid species. The northern ones are the ones over here, like Platanthera dilatata. Okay, that point right there. The southern ones are on that end. And notice the change index is more negative for the northern ones than it is for the southern ones. And in this case, it is, although there's again a lot of scatter, there is a significant relationship there. The northern species are having more trouble than the southern ones. So that's basically the state of our data. The fact that there doesn't seem to be a really simple answer here, although I would like to be able to tell you a good story, I think that may be revealing in itself. It kind of suggests to me that there's probably more than one factor involved, and those factors might differ from species to species. That's my guess as to what is going on. So if that is correct, there's no kind of single simple explanation for why we're seeing fewer orchids. Some may be declining because of succession. Some may be declining because they're at the southern edge of their range and it's getting warmer. Maybe some have big leaves and the deer are targeting them and so forth, but it's not clear that there's one overriding factor. Biology can be messy sometimes, you know, it's would that it weren't, but it is. All righty. So this is the orchid part of the talk. Are there, and the other part will be shorter. Are there any questions on that? I also give you time for questions at the end, but are there any questions specific to the orchids that have occurred to you? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Northern and southern what? I mean,
Okay, that means a species that has what and I'm skipping over stuff here and I shouldn't, but I calculated for each orchid species, I calculated what I call the latitudinal index based on where southern New England is in its range. So if southern New England is right at the south end of the range of the species, that would be a northern species. Most of its range is north of us, okay? A southern species would be one where most of the range of the species is south of us, and it just gets up into, you know, a little ways into Connecticut and Massachusetts. So that's the idea here. we're looking at where southern New England sits in the range of the species. And so the ones from the north don't seem to be, there's a lot of values down here for those northern species. But I should point out here, although I'm very pleased to have a p-value less than 0.05, these data, I think, are from the listed species. If I showed you a graph for the Franklin and Worcester County, it wouldn't be nearly this neat. Okay. So anyway, I think what's going on is probably different factors in different species and possibly multiple factors in some of the species. And that's the best I can do. And I pulled my hair out a lot over this. All right, you had a question, yes. Yes, well, first of all, in this work, some of our data is based on herbarium collections, but a lot of it, particularly in Franklin Worcester County, is simply based on observations by people like Matt and myself and a couple of colleagues on it. We spent hundreds of hours in the field, in the different towns, looking in different habitats at different times of year. As far as herbarium specimens in general, lots of people collect them, not so much today as they did in the past, but and their collections find their way into herbarium collections. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, the Natural Heritage Program, their data comes from a variety of sources. The old data might come from herbarium specimens that the state botanist has looked at in herbarium collections. But they also monitor and keep track of all known populations of state-listed species. And they try to revisit them at least every 25 years to keep them active. Some of it is done by state employees, some of it is done by volunteers who report to the state. And in many cases, they don't actually collect. Obviously, with these state-listed species, you can only collect if you have permission and the population size is big enough and so forth, if there's good reason to do it. Yeah.
The orchids, are they pollinated, I guess, by what I'm gonna call real pollinators? So in other words, I'm a pollinator, right? I mean, you've got.
I have not seen you out pollinating. I'm well.
Pollinators that pollinate native species. And there's pollinators that pollinate non-native species.
And sometimes they're the same insect.
Those bad guys, good guys, but the orchids, I guess I want to get to the keystone, any keystone species, and what would you define as keystone species, and are the orchids a large player, or do they need the real pollinators?
Well, I would say, first of all, yeah, first of all, I would say that I haven't studied orchid pollination in detail, but the orchid pollinators that I'm aware of are all or nearly all native. For example, I've never seen a honeybee visit an orchid. Maybe they do, but I've never seen it. It's interesting. It's very difficult to study orchid pollination because visits are, for most species, are really infrequent. And so it's, you know, you can't have much of a life if you're going to study orchid pollination. So the first point then is, I think we're dealing mostly with native pollinators here. Bumblebees, solitary bees, among the bees, a number of native lets, both moths and butterflies, nocturnal and diurnal, depending on the species. And then fly pollinated species, those are mostly small native flies. As far as whether any orchid is a keystone species, I would say probably not, because most of them are so rare. And I don't think if one, and I'm not advocating this, but if one was removed from the landscape, I don't think that would probably have dramatic effects on other species. I mean, As far as I know, there aren't any obligate pollinators of our native orchids. There are in the tropics, certainly, but not here, as far as I know. Yeah.
The orchids, everybody says they don't have smell. I believe them. I haven't tried smelling enough orchids to find out if they do, if I can smell it. Do you know if there are any orchids that have a scent?
Some of them have a little bit of scent. I'm a bit challenged in that respect, but some of them do have a little bit of scent. In general, our native ones are not known for their scent, though. I'm trying to think. So if they do have it seems to me I smelled a spiranthes once that I could get a little fragrance off. That's the lady's tresses. And I think there was a little bit, but boy, you had to get close to it. And yeah, it's almost like you had to inhale the flowers to smell it. All right, well, let's move on then. And second part of the talk, which is a bit shorter, and look at northern species. And what I was after here is, we all know climate change is taking place as a result of human activity. And this has been particularly prominent in about the last 40 or 50 years. Global temperatures have been increasing. We know that's affecting a number of biological phenomena. We know it's affecting bird migration times. There's evidence of that. I don't know. Have you gotten evidence from right here in the club? Do you keep records that would indicate that? Yeah. Insect emergence times are changing. In the plant world, blooming times, particularly of spring flowering species, are changing quite dramatically, at least a week for the earlier flowering things. But here I want to get at the question of whether the changes in temperature have been substantial enough to actually change the range of plant species. There's some evidence that the range of animal species has changed as a result, but animals tend to be more mobile than plants. Okay, so I wouldn't expect plant ranges to change nearly as easily as animals. Anyway, I thought this would be an interesting thing to look at. And we have a whole flora out there of 1,000 or so species. What should we look at? Well, it's the northern species that would be the ones of interest. And that is illustrated in these cartoons here. If we have a northern species, and this gets back to your earlier question, that's a species in which the bulk of the range is north of our area here. Okay, and if we have a bit of warming, we might expect that range to shift a bit northward. Okay, so it includes less of southern New England. In other species that have ranges that extend well to the south and to the north of southern New England, the kind of change that we've had isn't going to produce any changes in Massachusetts, for example. I mean, look at red maple or gray birch or something like that. They go well north, they go well south. Okay, if the temperatures increase a degree centigrade or so, they'll still be throughout southern New England. So that suggests that we should focus our attention on northern species. You might say also southern species, perhaps, moving in. I can answer that later if you want, but we didn't look at those, and there may be a reason for that. So we looked at northern species, but here again, we come across the issue of sampling. What species do we have good records of both in the historical period and the recent period, so we actually know if their range has changed? And here we thought, well, state listed species, because there are all those historical collections and there's good recent data because the state is tracking every known population of those. So we said, okay, let's look at rare, i.e. state listed northern species. So we scoured through the list of state-listed plant species. We identified a couple of dozen that fit our criteria for being northern. That is, we're near the southern limits of their range here. And they include things like, well, bristly blackcurrant. I was just talking with Matt about that. Up in Monroe, we find that. Twin flower, which is quite common in northern New England, but is pretty scarce. I don't know if you guys know of any populations, but pretty scarce down here. The showy mountain ash, which is different from the common Sorbus americana, which you see on Mount Wachusett and in the woods around here. That's a more northern species, and then there are some sedges and so forth, including that appropriately named few-flowered sedge that's a northern species. So these are just representatives of this group of northern species. So, to get at this question, we have his data on historical occurrences, what towns they were in, recent occurrences, what towns those were in. We went through every town in southern New England and calculated an average temperature for the last 30 years. So we have all of the towns in southern New England with its temperature. The average temperature obviously is going to be lower as you move north. It's also going to be lower as you go up in elevation. Okay, and by the way, this was not done by hand. This was largely automated and so forth. So we have that information. Now, we take an average temperature for the historical towns where a species occurred, an average temperature in the recent towns where a species occurred, and then we look to see if there's been a change. The prediction would be, if they're retreating northward, that the recent towns would have lower temperatures, right? They would be retreating to the northern and higher elevation towns. If there's no effect here, we would expect close to zero, variation around zero. Okay, what do we find? Well, this is the negative side. The recent towns, for most species, are colder than the historical towns, and in some cases by a couple of degrees centigrade. So that indicates that the town, these plants are tending to drop out of the southern and lower elevation towns in their ranges. That's why we have negative values here. And that difference is significant. Okay. I've extracted the data for the 6 species that have the largest sample size, just so you can see these. So, for example, here's twin flower. It was present in 62. It has been found in 62 total towns in southern New England. Historically, it was represented in 52 towns. In the recent period, 13, which shows that it has declined. The average temperature of the historical towns, 9.4. Yes, 9.4. Of the recent towns, 7.8. It's retreated to the colder towns between the historical period and the present period. If you look at every species here, current towns have a lower temperature than the historical towns. All 6 species. Okay, and that was the dominant pattern here. If you want to see it in map form, let's look at, for example, twin flower. Every place you see a shaded town was a place where it was known historically. The towns where it's known currently include a couple of towns in Connecticut, and otherwise it's the northern Berkshire Plateau and northern Worcester Plateau. Okay. Definitely, it's disappeared from Rhode Island, from the Cape, from most of the lower elevations in New England. Just one other example here, a less common species, shore sedge, used to be present here and there. Now it's restricted to the northern towns in the Berkshire Plateau. Okay. So that's kind of a neat story. And I don't really know of other data sets that show things quite like that. But there's a little wrinkle here. Maybe the reason that they're retreating to those northern towns is not because temperatures have changed, but for some other reason. If I go back here, in southern New England, would you say that this area has more human effect than that area, or vice versa? Yeah, I would say there's more human imprint on the landscape here. So could we just be looking at human effects on the landscape and have nothing whatsoever to do with temperature? Well, and this slide shows you that, oops. that there's actually correlation between the human population density of a town and the average temperature of that town. Greater human population densities in the warmer towns, lower human population densities in the colder towns. So this could be a factor. Bummer. And look at the temperature population I only have four. Perhaps pollinator. Alteration, but also important. People who have helped me at the herbarium. These projects. Because in academia, I'm afraid I don't know anything about moth decline. But as I pointed out here, a fraction of orchid species are dependent on moth pollination. And if those moths are doing what you say they are, declining by 90%, then I would expect that to have had an effect on the populations of those orchids. But I'm sorry, I would be way outside of my ability. Yeah. Talk to that guy Wagner down in Connecticut, right? Yes.
Do you have any idea when orchids evolved? How old are they evolutionarily?
Oh, goodness gracious. I don't have a date for that. I'm sorry. I really don't. I'm trying to think in the phylogenies that I've seen. Gosh, in monocots, I think they're one of the later branches, if I remember right, but I couldn't put a date on that for you. You might be able to get some info online about that, yeah. Sorry. Mhm.
Is anyone doing work along these lines in northern New England? Are we seeing, like you're saying that they seem to be retreating up into the colder, is anyone seeing those ranges or doing better up in northern New Hampshire?
No one is working with this particular group of species. There have been a couple of attempts to look at plant distributions in northern New England. One of them was done, I think, in Vermont by a former research student of mine who went on to do her PhD at University of Vermont. And I think they were documenting, in that case, a movement upward in elevation of some of the vegetation bands up there. There's also been some work done in the White Mountains on that kind of thing, and it seems the results have been a little bit equivocal on that. But no, I don't know of anyone who is doing this kind of broader geographic thing, which I think I would like to encourage people to do, because I think it's quite interesting. Yeah. Yes.
Why choose orchids to look at it specifically? Aside from the fact that they're cool little long.
They're charismatic.
Yeah.
In mega flora. Yeah.
But
Ah. Yeah, well, in answer to the first question, why orchids, it was because there have been quite a few anecdotal reports of decline. But it's really hard to know with the anecdotal reports, is this just an opportunistic species that kind of appears here and lives for a few years and winks out? And so if somebody reports on decline in a particular location, that may not be universally true. It may be true in that location, but it may be somewhere else they appeared that they weren't there before. So that was why I felt it was useful to do a more systematic evaluation of that. And case in point on appearing and disappearing, I don't know if you remember from actually one of those orchids that was increasing the autumn coral root, that little non-photosynthetic thing. We live in Paxton, and we have probably walked out, our road is fairly rural, and we walk up and down it for exercise all the time. I've probably done that, I don't know, 1,000 or more times in the years that I've been there. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, all of a sudden, this far from the road and that far from a telephone pole, there was a little population of autumn coral root. And I forget, we saw it one year, we saw a few the next year, it was gone the third year. We see it again one year, and then it's not there this year, something like that. So they do seem to kind of appear and disappear, and that's why we have to get a little bit beyond the anecdotal to get a more systematic. Now, as far as another plant group to look at this, in fact, the one that you mentioned, the Batricium, the grape ferns and so forth, that is also one that is shown that seems to be in decline according to a variety of studies. And that would also be a very interesting one to look at systematically. Now, one little bit of natural history there. I mentioned that all orchids have an obligate dependence on fungi for some phase in their life cycle. Well, the grape ferns are also known to have a particularly close association with fungi. And in fact, there was a very interesting paper done on a rare species of Batricium in Michigan called Batricium mormo. And they looked at all of the places where the species was known historically. And they went back to them and found that it was present in some of those places still, but it was not present in other places. They analyzed a number of things about the sites to see if they could figure out what's different between the sites where it still occurs and the ones where it doesn't. What they found was a strong association with the presence of earthworms. If the earthworms are there, they didn't find the Bertin. And so that could be where they did find the earthworms, the majority of which were introduced, they did not find the fern. Yeah. And whether that's true for other species of Batricium, I don't know. Whether it could also be true for orchids, I'm not sure about that either.
The other kinds of comparisons that I think of would be things like species that whose seeds are antispersed. What does that do to presence absences? What about perennial versus annual members of the taxonomic family or genus or whatever? And how that might show the same or different or whatever.
Yep, lots of things to look at. One, you mentioned the antispersed species, and it turns out that a fair amount of our spring flora, woodland flora, the spring ephemerals, many of those are antispersed. Violets, bloodroot, some of the sedges and so forth. And that's a group that you would think might have particular trouble in the face of climate change. I mean, ants are very industrious things, but they don't go marching, 50 kilometers, to put a seed in a more suitable climatic location.
Yes. Suitable site.
Well, certainly ants are incredibly effective in short distance dispersal, and our lawn is actually testament to that. Our lawn, our front lawn, over a period of, I don't know, what would you say, 10 or 20 years, has become almost a monoculture of European ginger. And European one. We also have the native one, and that is spread to all kinds of places in the yard where it wasn't before. But, modest distances, a few yards, maybe something like that. But no, there's lots of other patterns that would be interesting to look at. Yeah. Lots to do and life is short. Man. Yes.
The species maps that you showed.
Yes.
Is that the same one that I can find in your book on the flora of Worcester County?
Yes, you can. The flora of Worcester County has these maps for the species where it would be interesting, like red maple. You won't find a map because it's everywhere. But for the species where it might be interesting or whether they've changed, yes, you do have that in here, and we put maps in for every species in the Franklin County. Yep. And in addition, the maps that we have in there have symbols that indicate whether the records in a given town are only historical or whether they're recent or both. And so you can get, by looking at a map, you can say if there's a lot of pluses, that means this is a species that appears to be increasing. So, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, yes. Speaking of books, thank you. It's a good book about the native orchids or anything native, like the mushrooms they depend on, or organic, and anything that's really down in there about the.
Oh, goodness. I don't know of any recent one. Yeah, there was one by a fellow by the name of Dressler.
But it was pretty old, but I lost it in my fires.
Oh dear. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know of. Or did that guy Brown? Brown, Paul, there you go. That's the name, Paul Martin Brown. You might search Paul Martin Brown and orchid on Google and see what you come up with, because I think he wrote a book, but I'm not very familiar with it. So, yeah. Ah, you're very welcome.
Robert?
Yeah, and if you did want to look at these floras, I have the Franklin and Worcester County ones here and welcome to.
Your library.
Which library? All the library. Good for you. Good for you. Thank you, Nancy.